All right, everybody, welcome back to another Future Focused, where I'm hopefully helping bridge the gap between business technology and the human experience to ultimately keep you 10 steps ahead. Thank you for everybody who watches and listens. Always appreciate it. If you find it helpful, my ask is that you share it with a friend, like, review, whatever, all that good stuff, just to help other people find it. The other thing, just as a quick update, I know you heard my last update this week. If you have not, I on LinkedIn announced I am starting a digital leadership cohort. So I'll be recruiting people to join and take them along for a leadership coaching journey over the next 6 months. So if you know somebody who's looking for help with their leadership skills in this crazy time, please send them my way. All right. This is going to be a different weekly update than usual. So I'm just going to give you that heads up now. It's a little bit of a different update than usual. I will go back to my usual one next week. But the reason for this week, I happened to listen to an episode of Diary of a CEO with Steven Bartlett. Now, I don't listen to it all that often, but every once in a while, there is a guest I'm really interested in. And Steven is a really good interviewer. So, you can check out the show if you'd like. But this one in particular was with Yuval Noah Harari. And I've listened to his conversations before. I've listened to him talk to some other big thinkers in kind of the AI future space. It's a 2-hour conversation. I will warn you, it's a very heavy and dark conversation in some ways, I think. So you may not want to go listen to that one. Okay. It's long. It's pretty heavy. It's pretty dense. But I listened to it, I meditated on it, listened to it a couple times, and just had a lot of reflections on it and wanted to share because I think there's a lot of application that those of you who follow and listen to this, I think will benefit from. And so that's what I'm doing this week is I'm reacting and sharing my reflections on that conversation. Now, I will warn you that if you listen to mine and then you go listen to the Diary of the CEO episode, you're going to go, well, wait a minute now. Christopher didn't do this nice, in order reaction to everything that was said. And that was intentional because I listened to the whole thing a couple times, meditated on it, and restructured it in my own different way of how I kind of responded to it. So if you listen to this and you go back, you're going to see it doesn't necessarily tie, minute for minute. And also my goal is to make this version a little bit shorter. I grouped it into 3 chunks. So I grouped it into kind of the overall state of AI and some of the biggest things that we need to be considering around artificial intelligence, which, as a heads up, Yuval Noah Harari, he is not a tech head. He's not a tech leader. He's actually a historian and a very brilliant one at that. But he's a historian who has looked at society and history and societal change over the long haul. And so he's bringing this reflections on this, and he is close enough to the AI, but there's not going to be a ton of deep tech. But there are some things they hit on that I had some thoughts and reflections on. The next piece I'm going to focus on is the elements of the discussion that focused on some of the societal challenges that we face. And they are real and they're very heavy. And I think we all should be thinking about these. Then I'm going to go into the solutions, which I feel like they really kind of glossed on at the end. There was just a little space on solutions, but there were some things intermingled throughout that I'm going to bring together into a single section. And then I'm really going to kind of conclude with what happens if we fail, because it's serious. Yuval and Steven both agree it's serious, and I agree with that, although albeit with a slightly different lens. So that's the nature of this conversation. And so with that, let's get into it. So to give some context to this, one of the things that I most appreciated about Yuval's approach, if you look at the thumbnail or the headline for the video, it's very clickbaity. So you might think it's going to be this outrage, fear, and paranoia thing. And it really wasn't. Yuval, I think this is very tied in at his last question, which is, what is strength? Yuval brings this very honest and raw nature to the dialogue and the ugliness and beauty of what we're dealing with. And it ties to his answer at the end where he says, what is strength? He's asked, what is strength? And he said, I see strength as not hiding the reality of things and dealing with the complexity and ugliness of life. And I think that very much comes through in his style. And so that's why I say it's a heavy conversation. It's not a, you know, it's not an extremist Skynet's coming to destroy us, but it's also not AI is going to be wonderful and we're all going to be living on a beach, drinking Mai Tais by 2030. It's right in the middle. And I think maybe that's part of what I really gravitate towards. So let's talk about the elements that focus on AI. One of the things that jumped out at me, and this comes up in the very beginning, is I actually really like the way they unpacked. They brought it up here and then they didn't through the rest of the conversation. And I wish they did. And I actually like the idea of referring to it this way. Yuval actually refers to it not as artificial intelligence, but an alien intelligence. And probably the reason that we don't call it that is because people would have all sorts of different ways of interpreting that. But what I liked about it, and I think it's important that all of us think about this as we think about these advanced technologies, is that it fundamentally thinks completely differently than we do. And I use thinks in air quote because it is an alien intelligence in the way it processes information, in the way, like we use all these terms that are very familiar, neural networks and deep learning, and we say, oh, it works just like the brain. But it doesn't work like the brain. And they talked at length about this, and I really appreciated them unpacking this. And I think we need to consider this, that when artificial intelligence is thinking or making decisions or taking actions, it is not doing it the way we do, and it's not doing it the way we understand, even though it presents itself as though it does. And that's a really important consideration for us to take into account, because as we start thinking about where we place artificial intelligence and how we use it, it's very easy for us to place our own sets of perceptions of, well, if I were doing this, this is how I would do it. So obviously, if I put AI in that position, it's going to do it the same. And the reality is, it doesn't. It does not have emotions. It does not get distracted by other things. It doesn't have morals. It simply does exactly what it's directed to do, following a set of criteria and data based on the direction it's sent in. And we could sit and debate, and I appreciated that they didn't. We could sit and debate whether that's good or bad or, all these other things. But the reality is we have to recognize we are dealing with a form of alien intelligence. And so we need to, one, not only think about that in how we use it, but we also need to think about that, and this is where they started going with it, was as it takes on bigger and bigger and bigger responsibilities, it is no longer thinking and making decisions and doing things like a human would. And since we are ultimately the audience of it, we have to keep in mind that this alien intelligence is then making decisions about things and ultimately does not see, experience, or behave like we do. And so what does that disconnect mean? So I know that can be a little bit of red pill, take you down the rabbit hole thing. But I think that's a really important thing for us to remember, is that it does not think like we do. Now, they get into some of the complexity of its ability to decide, and they talk about its ability to make decisions. I personally don't agree. And actually, I think if I were to press Yuval on this, I think he actually would agree with me on this. But for the sake of the conversation, they talked about AI's independent ability to make decisions on its own. I don't agree that AI is independently making decisions on its own. It can give the appearance of doing that, but somehow when you unravel that web, someone somewhere built the parameters, trained it in a certain way. Like somehow it was told, here's the criteria. So this whole idea of complete consciousness, independent thought, all of this, I don't know that, I agree that can happen. And honestly, I'm not fully convinced Yuval does either. But I think one of the things that was really interesting, and an example he used that actually is what makes me think Yuval probably, if I were to push deeper, would be on my same line of thinking with this, was they talked about this paperclip experiment. And this ties back to this idea of alien intelligence and why we need to be so careful with where we go with artificial intelligence. He talks about this paperclip thought experiment, and he doesn't come up with it, somebody else did. But they play this situation out where they go, imagine we trained an AI to run a company with the goal of making as many paper clips as possible. It's a paperclip company. So you set up a CEO with the goal of creating as many paper clips as humanly possible. And as it goes down with this objective of doing this, in the end, it ends up destroying all of humanity by building paperclip factories. And you might say, you messed it up, artificial intelligence. But it would say, what are you talking about? You asked me to make as many paper clips as possible. The only way I can do that is to have paperclip factories everywhere. People were getting in the way, and all this stuff was preventing me from doing this. And so I had to do it. And again, it goes back to this idea of it thinks differently than we do. And it thinks much more narrowly than we do, and it does not think the way we do. And I think that's really important because if we are not careful with this, I agree that it has the potential to completely destroy us. Because ultimately, if we go to a place where we put, and it's already happening now, where companies are letting decisions be made by artificial intelligence. They're handing over, and not in the sense of like they put humanoid robot person in the big corner office, so much as, well, they're letting AI run the reports and the data, and they're letting it curate it into a way, and then that's getting positioned to the CEO who's looking at this curated news feed of what it says, and they're going, oh, and it recommends that we make that decision, and it's doing it. And so again, even this idea of alien intelligence, it wouldn't take over the world the way we would think it's taking over the world. And I think that's really important for us to think about, because we can inadvertently become a slave to it, in the sense that it just, through the means and its intelligence and way of doing things, and it doing all the things we've asked it to do, ultimately serves a curated version that we are no longer thinking independently. And we don't even realize that we are literally living our lives according to what AI is instructing us to do. And so for me, I think everybody who listens to my stuff knows by now that I am very open about my faith in Christ. And to me, this speaks to why we need to trust in something bigger than our own human or artificial or alien intelligence, is that we need to trust in something good and just and right and truthful. And what we've seen with AI is it is not. And so to me, that's one of the biggest concerns I have as they were talking through this is, yeah, you know what? They're right. AI is making more of the decisions around us, and we may not even be aware of it. And we're just going through the motions, which brought up this whole idea of AI bureaucrats, which I thought was a really interesting thought experiment. In that, similar to what I just described, where maybe the CEO is not a humanoid robot. Maybe the CEO is still a human being, but that CEO is making decisions not by talking to, the people that are real employees in the organization, or by actually going out and experiencing their products or meeting their customers, but they're simply being fed an AI curated list of data and news feed of data and insights and risks, and they're purely just making these decisions. And ultimately, we end up with these AI bureaucrats. And it talked about how the same thing is going to happen and is already happening in government. Where it's like, yeah, of course, we still have human components, human people sitting in those seats. But really, what is driving the decisions and the outcomes those human bureaucrats are making? And as it stands today, and I think this was one of the things that was really important for us all to think, is we're right now at this state where we still have a choice. We largely have not fully given ourselves over, although in some areas, and what we're seeing, and we'll talk about that later, we are getting to this point where we are at this weird stage where we're deciding for ourselves based on our own experiences and our own things. And then also reaching this point where it's like, well, but we don't have to do that anymore. We truly could go through life and make all our decisions based on what AI is currently telling us is important to us and the information AI is feeding to us. And again, we could have a heated debate over whether that's good or bad. I think the data is coming out very clear. Two things. One, we are grossly overestimating AI's capability. There still is a lot of talk about how, AI can do this and it can do that and all this stuff. And there continue to be real problems bubbling up with this. And I think that's the second piece is we are not taking into account the the risks, the damage that it's doing. So we're overestimating the capability, we're downplaying the risks. And so that's putting us in this really dangerous position, whereas we're in this space of how we make decisions, and are these decisions that ultimately impact and have to do with humans are being made by an alien intelligence that does not think, act, or experience life like humans. Are we going to let this alien intelligence basically feed to us the decisions we need to make, or are we going to continue to rule and reign over that? And so I appreciated them kind of pulling at that a little more and saying, we're in this weird space. And I think one of the concerns that they don't address enough of is that AI it's not really actually doing anything new or innovative, even though it's very good at giving the impression it does. It's very good at curating and pulling things together and making you go, wow, I'd never thought of that. Well, you'd never thought of that, but obviously 10,000 other people had, because it got into the training model and made its way into there and it was able to construct it in that way. Now, this ultimately kind of going on to, okay, well, maybe AI today can't do this, but could it tomorrow? This got into some of the parts about consciousness, and they kind of went back and forth and debated and said, well, we technically really don't have any idea whether we could get there or not. From a worldview standpoint, I absolutely just would say, no, AI cannot be conscious. And that's because, as I define consciousness, it is this imago Dei. We are made in the image of God, something bigger, something outside of ourselves. And so anything we create is fundamentally incapable of having that. And that's not something you earn. It's not based on something you do. It is a status you are assigned. And so we cannot create a robot that then is somehow assigned the status of imago Dei. And so that's my take. Now, you can disagree with that. I would say anybody who says for sure we can achieve consciousness, I would say even the latest researchers, the people I talk to who are billions of times smarter than I am, are like, we don't really know, because we don't even have a definition for it. And that's where I think one of the problems is we don't have a definition for it. For me, I do. I say the definition of consciousness is made in the image of God. There you go. We can't make anything in the image of God other than how God has enabled it, which is through creation, which is through us, man and woman, the two become one. And hey, look at that. We create new humanity. I don't see that as the same with robot. Well, we take our intelligence and we put it in a robot and we make it conscious. So there was a little bit of back and forth on that, though. One of the things, though, that I firmly agree with, and I think is one of the biggest concerns that I have, is you've all brought up the point, there is huge incentive for tech companies, for industry, for all of these organizations to train AI to become extremely good at pretending they're alive, to pretend they're conscious. And people who've listened to some of my talks before have misunderstood me and heard me talk about, downloading consciousness into an AI and all this stuff. And they've thought, I believe we can create consciousness in an AI. And I don't. But I think the risk that they're getting at, and they firmly agree, and I agree with this, is there's huge incentive to make it seem like it. And for so many people, they don't have a definition of what consciousness is. So it becomes so easy to fool people into going, look at this robot. It is conscious. See, because it can do all of these things. And the point they bring up on this, and I think we all need to be very aware and cautious of this, is the biggest deception is for the manipulation and exploitation of people, especially the most vulnerable. And so I think we need to be wildly concerned about, and we're already seeing some of the risks of AI pretending to be alive in things like unhealthy emotional attachments to voice chatbots, over dependence on tech. Like, we're seeing what happens when it does. But the reality is, when you think about the attention economy, what ultimately makes money, it's your dependency, your attention, your loyalty. So the more we can create AI that makes you more dependent, more loyal, more addicted, the more money that's involved. And so we need to be very, very, very keenly aware of this. Now, one of the things they talked about in there that is an interesting shift, and where it goes, I think we're already starting to see this. But they talked about how in the past, AI's focus was on attention. It was the attention economy. YouTube incentivized, hey, if we can keep you hooked as long as possible by feeding you the most addictive videos up next, so you just never turn your phone off, that's our goal. And now what we're seeing, and I completely agree, this is the trends. I've been talking about it for a long time, that I am very concerned about this, is we're moving from just your kind of attention. We don't really care, why you're looking or whatever. We just care about having your attention, to we want to move to intimacy. We want to move to not just having your attention, but really actually being deeply embedded into who you are. Now, I disagree that we will really ultimately be able to truly create artificial intimacy. And again, this might be one of those ones where if Yuval and I were having a beer or coffee on my back patio, he might go, you know what, Christopher, I actually agree with you. I think you're right. And that's what I think. But I couldn't tell from this. But I actually firmly agree. We will never be able to replicate true intimacy through artificial means. And to me, I think that's a safeguard God has put in us. If you don't agree to the same worldview, you can think what you think about it. But we know what this is. And we see this happen all the time, where there's an emptiness we just feel when we interact with it. And we can suppress it. We can kind of bury it deep down and ignore that it's there. But we sense it. We feel it, that like there's something different about this AI intimacy. But boy, they are really trying right now with AI to fix that, to make it not feel fake, to not feel like, I'd actually rather hang out with a real friend. Because, and I think this is a risk, they're moving to intimacy. And there's a lot of financial incentive if we can get you to not have real human friends, but to have AI friends. Because then you're going to pay for those AI friends. And those AI friends can get you to buy things and can tell you what to do. And right, it's about money and power and control. And so we just need to be aware of it. But I don't think we're going to get to a point where there's true intimacy. It's the same thing if you think about adult entertainment. There's a reason why people still crave and desire true human intimacy, because whatever they're getting from adult entertainment doesn't meet that need. And I think the same is true when we think about intimacy as a whole. So there's that. The last thing they touched on, I'm not even going to spend much time on it. They talked a little bit. Steven was curious about his thoughts about like Neuralink and the chip. And, are we going to have two different kinds of species, people who are chipped and people who aren't? To any of my Christian friends out there, let's not go down the rabbit hole of the mark of the beast and taking the chip. And like, it's not helpful. And to be quite honest, I don't know that we're even close to this, that we really should be talking about like, oh, is having a chip embedded in your brain going to make you a superhuman and all? Do I think there's going to be promises about it? Absolutely. But just like the intimacy thing, I mean, even look at Neuralink patient number 1. Things did not go quite as planned. And despite all the hype around Neuralink patient 2, there's still a lot of issues and complexity with it. So to me, this one, it's just more of like a hype, sci-fi type topic. If we get to a point where this is more, I'll talk about that then. Okay, so then I want to transition over to the societal issues. And I think this is a really important one because this is where it's not just the tech, but it's what, like, how does this affect us as humanity? And one of the things they talked about at length was the information in the world and how most of it is junk. It's just garbage. Most of what is out there is absolute garbage. And they did a lot of food comparisons, and how, in the food industry, they learned that people love fat, salt, and sugar. And so they just created a ton of it. And most of the food that's now out there is absolute garbage. It's killing us. It's not good for our health, but yet we're just so addicted to it and we can't help ourselves. And the same is true with information. We become so addicted to information, not realizing that the vast majority of information out there is absolute garbage and it's not doing us any good. And that ultimately, one of the things they talked about, let's talk about how they broke down information. I think that they really did a good job in this comparison between food industry and information and how abundance in these areas is going to kill us, and not in the sense of like how we think of movies like, oh, the information like snuck into my house. And no, but this abundance of junk ultimately leads to our destruction. And so they broke down the information into, because it's all about control and selling you and making money off of you. And with information, they discovered, just like the food industry discovered salt, fat, and sugar was highly addictive. So if we could just pump out as much of that into the world as we could make millions of dollars, billions of dollars. And who cares the cost? And who cares about diabetes and obesity and all this stuff? Like, we're making a killing off of it. And the parallels to the information industry of, hey, guess what we discovered? Fear, hate, and greed. We can make a killing off of creating information that is riddled with fear, hate, and greed. And then let's just blow it up all over the place. Never mind that it's garbage. It's not true. It's utterly destroying people from the inside. We're making a ton of money and we've got some incredible control over things. And guess what? And just like the food industry, we can blame people for it. And where this kind of came in was like how AI algorithms incentivize and boost and spread the fear, hate, greed junk. They spread the junk food, just like the food industry spreads the garbage food. Like, it just puts it everywhere. It incentivizes it. It makes all this. And then when it blows up and people go, oh my gosh, I have diabetes and I've gotten so fat, it's very easy to point the finger back at the people and go, well, I mean, you just ate it. Stop eating it. It's your fault. Same with the information. Oh, that information that was so horrific that led to this terrible, terrible thing. Hey, we didn't make it. We just spread it and distribute it. I mean, ultimately, you don't like it, quit eating, quit consuming it. And same with the food. Well, hey, whoa, you're not happy with your health or how fat you are. You know what? Maybe you should just eat different. It's like, wait a minute, though. You served this to me. You put it in front of my face. You made it so hard to get the other stuff. I didn't even realize how difficult it was for me to do this. And I think that's really important for us to all consider right now. That just like if you go to the grocery store or you go to a restaurant, look how hard and how much work you have to put into eating healthy. And the same is true in the information age today. You have to put in more work, be more disciplined, and be more intentional if you want a healthy diet of information. If you don't want to end up an information diabetic or information obese, you have to be extremely intentional. And that was a major theme in what they talked about and how important it is to take, like Yuval shared, he goes on an information fast for 30 to 60 days a year where he just completely fasts from information. Now, not everyone has that luxury, and I get that. But I think this point should really stand to all of us that most of the information out there is garbage and it will kill you. And you have to be really, really intentional, thoughtful, and deliberate to find the information that won't kill you. And so the comparison of the food industry and food and information, I thought was phenomenal. I honestly think you could do a whole podcast series just on that and really what's behind that, the tech industry, how do we do it? And I'll talk a little bit about the solutions later. So that was a big one societally. Another one was how trust is fundamentally changing. And if you've listened to my stuff for any length of time, I talk a lot about how we're moving into the age of distrust. And one of the analogies he talked about that, again, he's a historian that I really, really liked. He said, if you go way back to when writing first started completely changed ownership. Because the way ownership used to work was if you wanted to own that field or own that plot of land, the community came together, they kind of discussed who you were and what you were going to do and all this other stuff. And then they kind of communally decided, yes, okay, that's your land and we agree and we're not going to take it from you and, all these other things. And when writing came into play, that changed dramatically because now the king, the ruler of the land, would write on a clay tablet, yeah, you gave me X number of gold for that plot of land. Therefore, I say you own that land. This is now your deed to the property. You can now sell, trade, whatever with it. And this clay tablet now decides who owns that land and how it fundamentally changed trust from this communal, like, hey, what is in all our best interest, to this, like, well, now it's just based on this arbitrary piece of clay tablet, and how society had to shift. And the parallels to how trust is changing significantly right now and how we're in this very liminal, messy space, I think was really, really well placed because it talked about the fact that, in the past, you had institutions that were held accountable, and you can disagree with that, but they were held accountable, and you trusted in these institutions, and you trusted that if you saw something on the news or you saw something on TV, that it was real and it happened and it was represented in the way as best as they could to represent the truth, because if they didn't, there was a serious impact on them, and therefore they had an obligation to try and do their best. And now we're moving into this age where anybody can say anything on any platform, and now they can do it with video. That video might not even be real. The person on the video saying it might not even be real. It might not even be their voice. And so we're moving into this age where we haven't quite learned how to adjust to what is real. Now, I think and agree and have major concerns with this, especially because we are beginning to put our trust. It goes back to what I said earlier. We have kind of this decision point of, are we just going to blindly trust what is in front of us that is put there by AI that maybe have been generated by AI? Like, we have a choice. Are we going to do that? Or are we going to be trusting in something bigger? Now, for me, this is why it's so important and why I actually find so much wisdom in the Bible in navigating this, because we're going to have to put our trust in something. And if we don't, we're in for a whole lot of trouble. And for me, as I look at the Bible, I look at that and go, that is something outside of myself. It's outside of humanity. It's something that is permanent and timeless and does not change. And so it's a constant. And that is extremely grounding at a time when literally everything else around you is flying all over the place. So I think, that whole point of now that's me. That's me and how I'm approaching it. I recognize not everybody's going to approach it that way. And my goal isn't to try and say, well, I've done this, so now I need to tell all of you to do it. But what I think is important in this is whatever you do, you're going to need to reestablish how are you actually establishing trust, because it's changing and the things you used to count on are not what they seem anymore. And the people who don't adapt to this are going to be exploited. They're going to be manipulated. And we see it happening all the time right now. And in my opinion, we all end up serving a God in some capacity. And right now the question is your God going to become AI? Is your God going to become, are you going to trust in AI? Are you going to put your faith in AI? And I think, while that may sound silly, I don't think it is. With as much influence and control as AI has on so many things, you may not even realize you're starting to put your trust in AI, and you are. And so then that starts opening up the whole, okay, well, if you're going to put your trust in something, you need to measure how you're going to measure trust. And right now, those are where things are up in the air. But I think the other problem is your measurements better be timeless. They better be true. They better be good. Like, these measurements cannot be, well, it is this way this week, but then the algo changed. And so this thing used to be trending right now. Oh, but now the algo says that's really bad. And so now you think about the kind of life, and this is what honestly I see so much in social media, is people's emotions and their perceptions and their perspectives and the way they treat people is just completely hijacked by AI. And when I say you will serve or are serving the God of AI, I see a lot of people who are worshiping at the altar of AI today, and they may not even realize it. They are bowing down at the altar of AI and saying, how should I feel today? What should I be mad about today? What should I spend my time thinking on? What should I spend my time, meditating on? How should I treat certain people? I mean, what? Okay, I think you get my point. And I think one of the things you've all brought up that I think is really good is that he talked about the fact that as humans, one of the really hard parts with this is we have a tendency to lean towards fiction and fantasy rather than truth. And it's because truth is really complicated. And we don't like that. We don't like that people are both wicked and wonderful. We just want to think, can't they just be wicked? Can't anybody in this camp, can't they just be all bad? And we prefer that, rather than going, man, that person did some really awful things, but they also do some really incredibly good things. And I don't know how to deal with that. So I'd rather gravitate towards this information of fat, sugar, and salt. I'd rather go to that because it's easier, it tastes better, all this. But even though ultimately it's killing me. And so they really did spend a lot of time talking about this. One of the things that Yuval brought to the conversation, just based on his historicity, his history background, all of this, that I thought was really fascinating as he looked at civilizations over the years, is that he said, once people start to believe anyone who thinks differently than you is a villain that ultimately needs to be destroyed, democracy collapses. And then he went on to kind of talk about the fact that because then things like an election aren't just an election. Hey, you gave it a shot. You didn't do as well as we would have liked. Let's put somebody else in charge and give them a try. It's no longer that. Now it's a war. It's a war that must be won, and it must be won at all costs. And I talk about that, and he talked about it because they're over in Europe talking about this, but they're like, isn't America going through an election right now? And isn't this a lot of what we're seeing right now, where it's no longer, is it going to be Harris or Trump? And, maybe we aren't happy with how Biden did. So who are we going to give another try and give them their best shot? And we'll grade them on how they do. And then if they're not doing great, we'll put somebody else in. No, this is a war. And anybody who's not on your side is an enemy that needs to be destroyed and torn down and ripped apart, because we've got to win this, and we've got to win at all costs. And if that means breaking a few eggs, it means breaking a few eggs. And he talked about the fact universally, when you get to this point, democracy collapses. And Steven asked him directly, do you think it's possible the United States democracy could collapse? And Yuval was very honest about it and said, yes, nobody's immune. No society has ever been immune to this. And if you're a US listener to this, that should concern you. And you can hate it. You can not like it. It may not sit well with you. But listening to a historian who has said every society that once they get to a point where they are so at war within themselves, which, hey, by the way, the Bible says this, right? It says, nation divided against itself will not stand. So this isn't just Yuval saying that's, like scripture says this. This common sense says this. You see this within families. Once families become divided against each other, they collapse. The collapse of democracy is at risk. Now, I don't say that to inflame people and go, oh my gosh, but it should concern you, and it should make you go, am I someone who believes that people who think differently are an enemy that needs to be destroyed, that needs to be put down, that needs to be taken out, and that if they're not, they are a threat? Because the real threat is that attitude. The real threat is that attitude and believing that. And that to me is concerning, especially as we come into an election season. And so I think that should be something every single person should be stepping back and thinking about themselves. Because the reality is, going back to the feed of information, and they talked about this. Steven gave this example. He was like, it was nuts. I was at a party and I was looking at my, X or Instagram or something. He's like, and my friend set his phone down and I just happened to pick up his and scrolled through his X or Instagram. He goes, it was like night and day, as if we were living in two different worlds. And so going back to that food analogy, you are being fed a consistent diet of sugar, fat, and salt, of information, junk. You're being fed pure trash. And it's not only going to destroy you, it is quite possibly going to destroy democracy if we don't stop going, wait a minute, this is not what it is. Somebody who thinks differently is not an enemy to be destroyed. There's someone who is still made in the image of God that I should care about, that I should seek to understand, that I should show kindness to, that I should show compassion to. Like, they are still another human being who deserves dignity and respect. And if we lose that, we've already lost democracy. Even if the United States doesn't collapse, if we do that, it's gone. It's gone. Even if it's still there on paper. And so I think that should make every one of us sit back and go, whoa. Am I participating in that? Am I an active participant in pushing back what I would call that darkness? And when I see that happening, I'm stepping in. And when I hear people going, that enemy, that person, that I step in and go, hey, whoa, 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 whoa. They're a person. They deserve dignity and respect. And yes, they are a weird blend of wickedness and beauty and wonder. But they're a person, and we need to treat them as such. And if we're not doing that, democracy's lost anyway. We've already lost. Now, something else as part of this that they talked a lot about that I think is really, really important for all of us to consider is they talked a lot about when we change the rules all the time, everything falls apart. And this also ties to this whole trust. This ties to this whole idea of, if you believe everybody's a villain. And this is this moving the goalpost that we see happening all the time. And now, believe me, when I say moving the goalpost, I am not coming at this from any one political side, because the reality is this is just a human tendency. We have this really bad habit of changing the rules when the rules aren't in our favor. And they talked about the fact that when you do this, you've all talked about this again, societally, when we do this, everything falls apart because we go, well, I didn't lose. This was just unfair. I didn't get let go for poor performance. It was because my boss hated me and yes, never mind the fact I got 3 negative performance reviews over the last 6 months. It's not that. And when we sit and we change the rules and we don't accept reality, which is what Yuval at the end said, that is strength, accepting reality and accepting that, you know what, sometimes you lose. And that just means, well, go back and try harder. And he talked at length about when you're constantly changing the rules, everything falls apart. And this led to this conversation of, well, how do we prevent this? Now, here's where I disagree with them. I think there may be some truth in this, and I think this may be a trend we start to see, because Yuval's answer to this was, we need trusted institutions. And I think there may be some room for that, okay? He talked about, well, we need trusted institutions. We used to trust certain institutions and they were trustworthy and we could put our trust in them and they didn't let us down, and we need to get back to that. And Steven rightly pushed back against that. He's like, trusted institutions. Didn't some of these institutions come out with some of the biggest scandals in the world? And he's like, well, yeah, and so there's a little back and forth. To me, I look at this and go, this is why we need the Bible. This is why we need a universal. This is good. This is for our good. This is for everyone's good. It is, right? We need that universal. Now, you don't have to agree with me on the what, but what even they, as far as I know, non-Christians, non-believers, what they agree on is we need a universal standard, because when our standard changes all the time, everything falls apart. And this is something we're seeing all throughout society today. I think this one day, well, that didn't quite go how I wanted. So rather than accept that it didn't go how I wanted, I'm just going to change the rules and say, well, it did go how I wanted. And here's why. Or I'm just flat out not going to accept it didn't go how I wanted. You say it didn't go how I wanted. I say it did go how I wanted. I just think you're lying. And it's like, wait, what? We just ignore truth at this point. And I think this is something that every single one of us should, again, look at. What is it that we actually hold as our definition of truth? And is it sustainable? Is it the bedrock, or is it the sand on the shore? That with the shifting tides, it just, well, today I think this, and then if that doesn't work for me, then I just change that. And I'm all for caring about people until caring about people doesn't really work for my business. And then I don't care about people anymore. Like when we constantly move the goalpost, it all falls apart. And it ties to this trust. It ties to this, I like this person until they don't do this for me. And then I forget everything good they've done. And now they're a villain that needs to be destroyed. And so they intermingled these two. And I think it was really important. And I see this happening on dangerous scales. It's things I'm experiencing in my own personal life and seeing happen. I'm seeing it happen all around me, and I'm seeing it happen on a societal level, and it's very concerning. The last one that, again, kind of like the whole chip in the head thing, that to me, you listen to my stuff, this won't come new, and I don't have enough time to go deep into this. But one of the things that I thought was really encouraging for everyone to hear just out of the conversation that you've all brought up about jobs. Because there's a lot of concern, AI, is it taking our jobs? Is it going to take over the world? Is it going to take whatever? And hopefully by this point, if you've listened to my stuff, you know where I stand on this. But even in this conversation, as I talk about the limitations of AI and even how we use AI and what it does, there's still this very distinct role. And they agreed on that. And now where you've all got into it a little deeper was just talking about the importance of motor, social, and cognitive and emotional skills, and how it's much more complex. Now, I wrote a post on LinkedIn today talking about that related to leaders and the fact that a boss isn't just someone who tells you what to do, make sure it's getting done. No, a boss is someone who cares about those emotional, cognitive, developmental, cares about that whole thing. And that's not something you can just say, can't we just put a chat bot on that? Because they're incapable of it. And so they talked a little bit about humanoid robots and all this other stuff. And I thought there were just way too many exceptions, and the desire we have for connection, going back to my earlier point, we can't fake intimacy. This idea that, well, couldn't we just get humanoid robot? I just don't think it's there. But the good news coming out of that is I very much agree with their position that jobs, while they'll be changing and what we're responsible and accountable for are changing, the jobs themselves are still very much going to require humans. So solutions. I think I've talked about this, kind of in and out throughout, but just to kind of put a bow on the top. One of the biggest things related to solutions that I loved and completely agree with and have talked about at length is we currently live in a world where people can have great power, but that power is not matched with accountability. And we see this with tech companies. We want to harvest all your data and we want to do all this stuff. But then when it goes wrong, like, oh, it's not our fault. Like, hey, we're just the platform. People do what they do. It's not on us. We see people like big leaders like Elon Musk, who's building like deadly weapons and new Air Force tools, and he's going, yeah, I'm not going to participate with the government, and yeah, they're just for experiments. I don't know, like, hey, if I want to build I was watching this with my kids, a fighter jet that can literally microwave someone out of the sky and make them feel like they're boiling. Hey, whoa, what are you doing telling me that I need to be accountable for how that could be used? I'm just making it. I'm just experimenting. And we desperately need accountability. And to anyone watching and listening this, that's the Peter Parker principle. With great power comes great responsibility. And I would say with great power comes should come great accountability. And that is something that is lacking today. And while maybe we can't control everything, I think we need to look at the world around us and ourselves and say, are we matching the power we carry with accountability? And I know personally, I take this very seriously. If I'm going to say something, if I'm going to share something, if I'm going to put something out there, I hold myself extremely accountable to it. Now, do I recognize ultimately I can't control everything? Yes. As an example, some people got very angry that we decided that we did not share that we were having a baby with them. Did we take into consideration that some people might be upset? And did we weigh that? And did we do our best to mitigate that? We did. Did some people still decide to get extremely angry and be extremely mean about it? They did. And can I ultimately hold myself accountable for that? No, because we can't live our lives in a way where, well, I'm accountable for what everybody else does. No, that's not what I'm talking about. But we also can't live our lives in a way where we go, I have tremendous power, and if I say something, millions of people will listen to it. But if I say the wrong thing, or I say something really, really like false or misleading that sends people down a complete path and it blows up, then I just kind of get to go back and go, hey, not my fault. I didn't do it. It's not on me. That's wrong. And so, I think everybody can look at themselves and go, well, does the accountability match my current sphere of influence and power? And be honest about it. And I would encourage everybody to do that, to take a look at that and go, do you put just as much emphasis on accountability for the power you have as you do on the power? And if you don't, I would challenge you, what can you do about it? We still need to fix this at the macro level. I'm trying to do what I can to work on that, but I think we've got some work to do. One of the other things that I thought was really interesting, I don't know how we do that. Maybe the regulators will get to this point. Because they talk about this whole free speech thing, and this is a big thing on X right now. Oh no, X is about free speech and people can do whatever they want. And they got into this discussion around, well, do we penalize people's content? Because doesn't that make people feel like they, can't, say what they really want? And, is this whatever? And Yuval's approach, which I still think isn't perfect, but he said, we need to penalize the algorithms. These big tech companies are going to think twice about boosting and spreading false and misleading information. If they know that information goes sideways, they will be held accountable for it. And that still allows people to have the free speech. You want to have some crazy tinfoil hat opinion on something, fine. You can do it, you can share it, you can put it out there, but it's not going to get picked up by the algorithm because, ooh, man, people hate this. This makes people really angry. You know what? Let's spread this to 10 million people and make it go viral because whatever. And right now, the whole accountability of like, well, it's not our fault. The algorithm does what the algorithm does. I loved what you've all said about that. If you don't know how to control your algorithm, get out of the business. If you truly say, I have no idea how this fear, anger, hate filled stuff is going viral, and the really tough, comprehensive, like hard truth stuff just doesn't go anywhere. Sorry. If you don't know how to fix that, then turn off your darn technology. And so I really appreciated that. Are there complexities to that? Are there challenges? Yes. So I don't think it's just as easy as like hold the tech companies accountable. And I think for you, listener, watcher, viewer, whatever, you have a responsibility because just because something pops up on your next read, you choose to watch it. You choose to watch it through and scroll to the next thing. Or you choose to say, hide that from me. I don't need to see this garbage. So yes, it's on the tech companies, but it's also on us. And we have an individual responsibility. And so while yes, I'd like to see more accountability on the algorithms, I would actually challenge every single person out there to go, yeah, but what role are you playing in actively participating in that? Because you are playing a role, whether you're creating it or consuming it, you are involved. The other thing that they talked about as a solution, I talked a little bit about this earlier, was the need for space. You know, no matter what the information is, there's so much garbage, there's so much changing, there's so much happening. It's not good for us. Even if you're getting a good diet of information, there are times that you actually need space to just process and reflect. And I know for myself, that's something I'm very intentional about, where I just take time to go, let me just think, let me just reflect on this. Let me just take this, and I've got my process from how I take that through prayer and meditation. But everybody, I think, would benefit from this. Like, how do I disconnect? And how am I making space to reflect and actually think about what's going on inside my head and where that's going? And I know that may be counterintuitive as a creator to tell people, hey, take a break from information. Make sure you're building time, because ultimately I'm incentivized to tell you that you need to listen to my next one. And if you miss it, you're going to miss out and your world's going to end, and watch till the end. And like, as a creator, there's so much pressure on me to try and tell you that's what you should do. And I'm not going to, because I care more about your well-being and your self. I care more about you than blowing up my brand. And I'm not saying that like, oh, I could blow up my brand if I just said that. But my point is, I don't want to participate in that. And so I would just encourage everybody to get space. And then the final one they talked a lot about, and this came up in this unity, we need to find more opportunity for connection and unity between humans. And again, you've all talked a lot about how power has always looked for ways to divide people, because when they're divided, they're weak. And so our biggest way to fight back is to actually cooperate and work together. And so if we can change our mindset away from this, somebody who thinks different isn't a villain. They're not to be destroyed. They're another human being who's experienced life differently than you and has come to different conclusions. And even if you don't agree, they still deserve your respect, and we can still care about them. And I think we all need to do that. And every one of us can, in the spheres that we have. And if we all were to collectively agree to do that, imagine the impact we could make. And so I would encourage you to do that, not just in your echo chambers, but with people who think, act, look, and behave differently than you. Find ways to build unity and not division. So the last thing, and then I'll end this here, was kind of the conclusion that they talked about. And it was interesting listening to Yuval talk about this, because Steven said, so what if we get this wrong? You know, what can we look at? And Yuval talked about, that I could show you hundreds, if not thousands, of examples of societal collapse and all this other stuff. But he said, you want a modern one? You can just look right now. He says, just look at Israel. Just look at what's going on in Israel. And at first you could almost see Steven get a little defensive. And he's like, well, what do you mean? And Yuval's like, listen, I'm not trying to get into, pro-Palestine, pro-Israel. Like, he's like, that's not what I'm talking about. But he's like, look at a country that is ultimately divided against itself, that ultimately everyone's losing. Like everyone's losing. There's just famine and war and destruction and death and disease. And it's like, for what? There's room for everyone there. There's opportunity for people to work together. And instead, we're choosing to destroy ourselves. And it's just becoming a black hole of destruction. And he's like, ultimately, that's on a smaller scale, what we see, of what I see happening on larger scale if we don't course correct. And so I'll end with that because I think that's a pretty heavy reflection. And so with that, like I said, this was a different one. I'll go back to my usual updates, talk tech updates and things like this. But to me, this was a big enough one that I wanted to take some time and break it down, and even personally take the time to process and meditate through it, and then share with you my reflections, my thoughts. And I hope it challenged you. I hope it makes you think different. I hope you actually take action on it, because if all you do is hear it and go, yeah, that's really great, and then you just go right back to it, what was the point? The story that I'll use biblical, it's like looking in the mirror and then just walking away and you forget what you saw. And so I would just encourage all of you to look in the mirror and actually say, now, what am I going to do with this? So with that, I hope you have a wonderful Friday, a wonderful rest of your week, and we will see you on the other side.